When a racist store owner humiliates Maya by refusing to serve her, he thinks he'll face no consequences. But Maya, a determined consumer rights inspector, takes a stand. Watch how her fight for justice uncovers hidden truths, holds him accountable, and inspires a community to embrace change. A powerful story of resilience and transformation. The bell above the door chimed as Maya stepped into Peterson's Gift Emporium, a small shop tucked into the corner of a quiet suburban plaza. The store was quaint, with polished wooden floors and shelves neatly arranged with trinkets, candles, and decorative items. Soft jazz played in the background, and the faint scent of lavender hung in the air. Maya adjusted the strap of her leather handbag and looked around. She had come here with one purpose: to find a birthday gift for her young niece, a vibrant child with a love for art and crafts. Spotting a section of handmade journals and colorful pens near the back, Maya smiled to herself and made her way toward the display. Behind the counter, Mr. Peterson, the store's middle-aged owner, watched her every move. He was tall and stocky, with graying hair and a stern expression that rarely softened. His posture was rigid, his piercing gaze betraying a sense of suspicion as he tracked Maya's path through the store. "Can I help you with something?" he called out, his tone flat and disinterested. Maya glanced up, offering a polite smile. "I'm just browsing, thank you," she replied, her voice warm and pleasant. Peterson grunted in response but didn't look away. His scrutiny was palpable, making Maya feel like a trespasser rather than a customer. Undeterred, she turned her attention back to the display, carefully selecting a pastel-colored journal and matching pens. As she approached the counter to pay, Peterson's demeanor grew colder. He stood stiffly, his lips pressed into a thin line, as though bracing himself for confrontation. "Are you sure you can afford this?" he asked abruptly, his words cutting through the soft background music like a blade. Maya froze, her smile faltering. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with disbelief. Peterson shrugged, gesturing vaguely at her purchases. "These items aren't cheap," he said. "We cater to a certain clientele here." The implication hung heavy in the air. Maya's chest tightened, but she maintained her composure. "I wasn't aware that your store had such restrictions," she said, her tone steady. "I'd like to pay for these, please." Peterson didn't move. Instead, he leaned forward, his expression hardening. "I think you'd be more comfortable shopping somewhere else," he said. "I have the right to refuse service, and I'm exercising it now." A tense silence enveloped the store. Maya glanced around, noticing the few other customers who had stopped to watch the exchange. Their faces registered shock and discomfort, but none of them spoke up. Maya set the items down on the counter. "If that's how you feel, I won't argue," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the humiliation simmering beneath the surface. She turned and walked out of the store, her heels clicking against the polished floor. As the door closed behind her, the muted chatter of the other customers resumed, but the weight of what had just happened lingered. Outside, Maya paused to take a deep breath. She had faced moments like this before, moments where prejudice masked as policy tried to diminish her worth. But this time felt different. This time she wasn't going to let it slide. As Maya walked back to her car, the encounter played on a loop in her mind. The sting of humiliation was sharp, but beneath it was a growing resolve. This wasn't the first time she had faced this kind of treatment, but something about Peterson's blatant disrespect made it impossible to ignore. She gripped her car keys tightly, her jaw clenched. By the time Maya reached home, she had already made up her mind. She wasn't going to let this go. Tossing her keys onto the kitchen counter, she sank into a chair and pulled out her phone. Her best friend, Clara, picked up on the second ring. "Maya, what's up?" Clara's cheerful voice provided a stark contrast to Maya's subdued tone. "Hey," Maya said, exhaling deeply. "Something happened today, and I need to talk about it." Clara listened intently as Maya recounted the incident at Peterson's Gift Emporium. By the time she finished, Maya could hear Clara's indignation crackling through the phone. "He did what?" Clara exclaimed. "That's outrageous! You should report him immediately!" "That's exactly what I plan to do," Maya said, her voice firm. "I can't let him get away with treating people like that." Who knows how many others he's humiliated? You've got the perfect platform for this, Clara said. You're literally a regional inspector for consumer rights. You can shut his store down if he's violating regulations. Maya hesitated for a moment. I don't want this to seem personal, she said. I have to handle it professionally, by the book. And you will, Clara reassured her. But that doesn't mean you can't hold him accountable. He deserves to face the consequences of his actions. The next day, Maya began her research. She delved into Peterson's store history, scanning consumer reviews and local business records. It didn't take long to uncover a troubling pattern. There were multiple complaints about Peterson's behavior, many of them eerily similar to her own experience. Customers described being watched closely, receiving rude comments, or being denied service altogether. Some mentioned feeling unwelcome based on their appearance or background. One review stood out to Maya. I've never been treated so poorly in a store. The owner looked at me like I didn't belong and refused to sell me anything. I wouldn't recommend this place to anyone who values respect. Maya made note of the complaints, adding them to a growing file of evidence. She also discovered that Peterson's store had narrowly passed inspections in the past, with warnings issued for failing to comply with certain consumer rights regulations. Determined to gather more information, Maya reached out to former employees. A few were hesitant to speak, but one young woman named Danielle agreed to meet her. Over coffee at a local cafe, Danielle shared her experiences working for Peterson. He was always like that, she said, stirring her drink absently. He had this idea of who his ideal customer was, and anyone who didn't fit that mold wasn't welcome. Did you ever challenge him on it? Maya asked. Danielle shook her head. I tried once, but he shut me down. Said it was his store, his rules. It made working there unbearable, so I quit after 6 months. Maya thanked Danielle for her honesty, adding her account to the growing case file. With each new piece of evidence, her determination solidified. This wasn't just about her experience. It was about preventing others from enduring the same mistreatment. As word of Maya's investigation spread, she began receiving messages from members of the community. Some shared their own negative experiences at Peterson's store, while others offered their support and encouragement. You're doing the right thing, one email read. People like him shouldn't be running businesses that are supposed to serve the public. The outpouring of support gave Maya a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just standing up for herself, she was standing up for everyone who had been made to feel less than by someone like Peterson. By the end of the week, Maya had compiled a comprehensive report detailing Peterson's discriminatory practices, past violations, and the impact on the community. With her findings in hand, she prepared for the next step, an unannounced inspection of Peterson's store. As she reviewed her notes one last time, Clara called to check in. How's it going? She asked. I've got everything I need, Maya replied. The evidence is solid, and I'm ready to make sure he's held accountable. Good, Clara said. People like him count on the fact that no one will push back. You're proving them wrong. Maya smiled. This isn't just for me, she said. It's for everyone he's ever made feel small, and I'm not stopping until justice is served. Back at Peterson's gift emporium, life seemed to carry on as usual, or so Mr. Peterson thought. The store owner, still brimming with his usual air of self-importance, dismissed the incident with Maya as nothing more than a minor annoyance. Sitting in his small office at the back of the store, Peterson sipped his coffee and scrolled through his email. Business had been slow for months, but he blamed the rise of online shopping and outsiders rather than any flaws in his own practices. In his mind, the confrontation with Maya wasn't a misstep. It was an act of protecting his store's integrity. People like her don't appreciate what I've built here, he muttered under his breath, glancing at the modest sales figures on his computer screen. Peterson's narrow worldview was evident in the way he ran his store. He prided himself on catering to a specific type of customer, those he deemed worthy of his carefully curated merchandise. While he justified his behavior as maintaining exclusivity, the truth was far less noble. His biases shaped his interactions, and anyone who didn't fit his narrow perception of an ideal customer faced his subtle, and sometimes blatant, discrimination. The employees of Peterson's store were well aware of his tendencies. Many of them had witnessed similar incidents before, though they rarely intervened. Most were young and relied on the job to pay their bills, making it easier to stay silent than to confront their boss. "He's just set in his ways," one employee, Kyle, often said when asked about Peterson's behavior. But even Kyle, who had worked at the store for 2 years, was beginning to question his loyalty. One afternoon, Kyle approached Peterson with a suggestion. "Hey, Mr. Peterson," he began hesitantly. "I was thinking, maybe we should do something to attract more customers, like a loyalty program or—" "We don't need gimmicks," Peterson snapped, cutting him off. "Our customers come here because they value quality, not discounts or free perks." Kyle frowned, but didn't argue. It was no use. Peterson was convinced that his way of doing things was the only way, even as the store's foot traffic continued to decline. That evening, Peterson closed the shop and locked the door behind him, feeling a rare twinge of unease. He couldn't shake the memory of the look Maya had given him as she left the store. It wasn't anger, at least not entirely. It was a look of quiet determination, one that hinted she wouldn't let the matter rest. But Peterson brushed the thought aside. "What's she going to do?" he muttered, shaking his head. "People like her always play the victim, but they never follow through." The next morning, however, his sense of control began to waver. He noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere among his employees. They exchanged glances when he spoke, whispered in corners, and avoided his gaze. Kyle, in particular, seemed unusually quiet, completing his tasks without his usual attempts at conversation. Peterson's unease grew when a regular customer, Mrs. Whitman, hesitated at the counter after making her purchase. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice tinged with concern, "I saw something about your store online. A woman posted about a bad experience here. You might want to look into it." Peterson's face reddened, and he forced a tight smile. "Thank you for letting me know, Mrs. Whitman. I'll handle it." As soon as she left, Peterson grabbed his phone and searched for the post. What he found made his stomach sink. The incident with Maya had been shared on a local community forum, sparking a heated discussion. "I've shopped there before, and he's always been rude. It's about time someone called him out. He treated me the same way once. I'll never go back." Peterson slammed his phone onto the counter, his hands trembling. For the first time, he began to realize the potential consequences of his actions. But rather than reflecting on his behavior, he fumed at what he saw as an overreaction. "They're blowing this out of proportion," he muttered angrily. "It's just a misunderstanding." What Peterson didn't know was that Maya had already begun her investigation, and his store was about to face scrutiny far beyond an online backlash. Maya's resolve only grew stronger as she prepared for her investigation into Peterson's gift emporium. Sitting at her desk, surrounded by stacks of notes and printed complaints, she meticulously pieced together the puzzle of Peterson's discriminatory practices. Each review she uncovered and each conversation she had with former employees painted the same troubling picture. Peterson's store wasn't just exclusive, it was exclusionary. Her first step was to formalize her findings. Maya compiled the customer complaints she had gathered from online forums, focusing on patterns of behavior. Customers repeatedly described feeling unwelcome with phrases like, "He looked at me like I didn't belong," and "refused service without explanation," appearing in review after review. Maya also reached out to regulatory bodies, requesting past inspection records for the store. The reports confirmed her suspicions. Peterson had been flagged twice for failing to display mandatory signage regarding consumer rights and accessibility. Though the violations were minor and had been resolved, they hinted at a pattern of neglect toward inclusivity and compliance. Next, Maya focused on gathering first-hand accounts. Her meeting with Danielle, a former employee, had been eye-opening, and she wanted to hear from others who had worked under Peterson. After sending out a few inquiries, she connected with another former worker, James, who had quit after a particularly heated argument with Peterson. "Working for him was exhausting," James said during their phone call. "He made it clear that he didn't want certain types of people in the store. He never said it outright, but you could tell by the way he treated people." James recounted an incident where Peterson had scolded him for assisting an older black man who needed help finding a gift. "He pulled me aside afterward and told me to focus on the customers who actually buy things," James said bitterly. Maya added James's testimony to her growing case file. With each piece of evidence, the weight of Peterson's actions became more apparent. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a systemic issue rooted in bias and exclusion. As the week progressed, word of Maya's investigation began to spread throughout the community. Neighbors who had seen her post on the local forum reached out, sharing their own experiences and offering words of encouragement. One email in particular caught Maya's attention. It was from an elderly woman named Mrs. Jenkins, who described an unsettling encounter with Peterson a few months earlier. "I went in to buy a gift for my granddaughter," Mrs. Jenkins wrote. "He was so rude, watching me like I was going to steal something. I left without buying anything. It broke my heart because my granddaughter loves that store." Maya felt a surge of determination as she read the message. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was standing up for everyone who had been mistreated by Peterson's prejudices. Her final step was to prepare for the inspection itself. Maya reviewed the regulatory guidelines she would be using to evaluate the store, ensuring that her approach would be fair and objective. She didn't want Peterson, or anyone else, to claim that her actions were driven by personal vendetta. The inspection would focus on key areas: compliance with consumer protection laws, accessibility, and fair treatment of customers. Maya also planned to observe Peterson's interactions with customers and employees, taking note of any behaviors that reflected his discriminatory mindset. On the morning of the inspection, Maya stood in front of her mirror, adjusting her blazer. She felt a mixture of nerves and resolve. This wasn't her first time conducting an inspection, but it was the first time she felt such a personal stake in the outcome. Clara called just as Maya was about to leave. "Are you ready?" Clara asked. "More than ready," Maya replied. "I've got the evidence, the support, and the law on my side." "Good," Clara said. "Remember, this isn't just about holding him accountable. It's about setting a precedent for everyone who's ever been treated unfairly." Maya nodded, even though Clara couldn't see her. "I won't let them down," she said. As Maya drove to the store, her mind raced with thoughts of the people she was representing. She thought about Danielle and James, Mrs. Jenkins, and all the others who had been mistreated. This inspection wasn't just about Peterson. It was about making a statement that prejudice had no place in business or in the community. When she arrived, she parked a short distance away and took a moment to compose herself. Then, with her clipboard in hand and her assistant by her side, she stepped into Peterson's gift emporium. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, signaling the beginning of what would be a turning point, not just for Peterson, but for everyone who believed in fairness and justice. The bell chimed as Maya stepped into Peterson's gift emporium, her assistant close behind. The familiar scent of lavender wafted through the air, but the atmosphere felt tense. Maya was dressed in her professional attire, a tailored blazer and crisp white blouse, and carried a clipboard in one hand, radiating authority. Behind the counter, Peterson glanced up, his expression shifting from indifference to unease as recognition dawned. For a moment, he simply stared at her, unsure of how to respond. "Good morning, Mr. Peterson," Maya said evenly, her tone calm but firm. "I'm here to conduct a routine inspection of your store as part of the Consumer Protection and Fair Practices Program." Peterson's face flushed a deep red. "An inspection?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Yes," Maya replied, holding up her official identification. "We've received reports about potential violations, and I'm here to ensure your store is compliant with all relevant regulations." Peterson opened his mouth to respond, but closed it again, his eyes darting to the clipboard in her hand. For the first time, he seemed at a loss for words. Maya's assistant, a young man named Eric, stepped forward with a small bag containing inspection tools. "We'll be evaluating your compliance with consumer rights laws, accessibility standards, and general customer service practices," Eric explained. "Fine," Peterson muttered, his jaw tight. "Go ahead." Maya nodded and began the inspection, starting with the layout of the store. She noted the lack of required signage informing customers of their rights, a violation Peterson had been warned about in the past. She also observed that certain areas of the store were cluttered, making them inaccessible to customers with mobility challenges. As Maya worked, Peterson trailed behind her, his discomfort palpable. He occasionally muttered under his breath, but Maya ignored him, focusing on her task. When she reached the counter, she examined the cash register area and found another issue: the absence of a visible complaints register, which businesses were required to maintain. She made a note on her clipboard, her pen moving with deliberate precision. "This is ridiculous," Peterson finally said, unable to contain his frustration. "I've been running this store for years without any problems." "Mr. Peterson," Maya said, turning to face him, "this inspection isn't about the past. It's about ensuring that your business meets current standards and treats all customers fairly." Peterson scoffed, but said nothing further. As the inspection continued, Maya observed how Peterson interacted with customers. A young woman entered the store to browse, and Peterson greeted her with exaggerated politeness. It was clear he was trying to put on a good show, but his unease was evident. Maya made no comment, but she noted the shift in his behavior. She could tell he was trying to salvage his reputation, but the evidence she had already gathered spoke volumes. When the inspection concluded, Maya and Eric returned to the counter to summarize their findings. Peterson stood stiffly, his arms crossed, as Maya read from her clipboard. "Mr. Peterson, we've identified multiple violations during today's inspection," she began. "These include failure to display required consumer rights signage, inadequate accessibility for customers with disabilities, and the absence of a complaints register. These issues will be reported to the relevant authorities, and you'll receive an official notice outlining the necessary corrective actions." Peterson's face darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "And what if I don't make these changes?" he asked defiantly. "Non-compliance will result in fines and could ultimately lead to the suspension of your business license," Maya replied firmly. "I recommend addressing these issues promptly." Before Peterson could respond, the bell chimed again, and a few locals entered the store. Among them was Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly woman who had emailed Maya. She paused when she saw the interaction at the counter, her expression shifting to one of quiet satisfaction. Peterson glanced at the newcomers and quickly adjusted his tone. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll fix it." Maya held his gaze for a moment before nodding. "Good. I'll be following up to ensure compliance." As Maya and Eric prepared to leave, Peterson called out, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Was this personal for you?" Maya turned back, her expression calm. "This was about accountability, Mr. Peterson," she said. "Fair treatment isn't optional. It's a requirement. Have a good day." With that, she walked out of the store, the bell chiming behind her. Outside, several locals approached her, thanking her for taking a stand. "You've done something important today," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you." Maya smiled, her resolve stronger than ever. She knew the inspection was just the beginning, but it was a crucial step toward justice and equality. The day after the inspection, the tension at Peterson's gift emporium was almost tangible. Word of Maya's visit had spread quickly through the community, and the store was noticeably quieter than usual. Customers trickled in sporadically, many of them glancing around as if they were seeing the store in a new light. Peterson, on the other hand, was far from quiet. "She came in here like she owns the place," Peterson grumbled to his employee Kyle as he rearranged items on a shelf. "This is my store, my rules." Kyle hesitated before responding. "I think she was just doing her job, Mr. Peterson," he said cautiously. "The violations she mentioned, they're serious." Peterson glared at him. "You think this is fair? You think someone like her has the right to come in here and tell me how to run my business?" Kyle didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. Peterson's frustration boiled over when Maya returned later that afternoon. Dressed in casual clothes but carrying the same confident air, she entered the store to speak with Peterson about the official notice he would be receiving. The bell above the door hadn't even finished chiming when Peterson stormed out from behind the counter. "What do you want now?" he snapped, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the few customers browsing the aisles. Maya remained calm. "I'm here to clarify the next steps, Mr. Peterson," she said evenly. "You'll receive a detailed report outlining the corrective actions required to bring your store into compliance." "Compliance?" Peterson scoffed, his face turning red. "This is my business. I don't need anyone telling me how to run it, especially not you." Maya's gaze was steady, her composure unshaken. "Mr. Peterson, this isn't about you or me. It's about your responsibility as a business owner to treat all customers fairly and operate within the law." Peterson took a step closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You think you can waltz in here, dig up a bunch of so-called violations, and ruin my reputation?" Maya didn't flinch. "Your reputation, Mr. Peterson, is a reflection of your actions," she replied. "If you want it to improve, you'll need to make changes." The quiet determination in her voice seemed to disarm him momentarily, but his anger quickly returned. "You have no idea how hard I've worked to build this place," he said, his voice rising again. "And now you are trying to tear it down." Maya took a step back, giving him space to calm down. "I'm not here to tear anything down," she said, "but I won't stand by while you treat people unfairly. This is your opportunity to make things right, not just for your business but for the community you serve." As she spoke, a few customers gathered near the counter, their curiosity piqued by the confrontation. Among them was Mrs. Jenkins, who stepped forward to address Peterson. "Mr. Peterson," she said gently, "maybe it's time to listen. I've been coming to this store for years and I've seen how you treat people. It's not right." Peterson's eyes flicked to her, his expression softening slightly. "Mrs. Jenkins, you know I've always valued your business," he said, his tone defensive. "Then show it," she replied firmly. "Not just to me, but to everyone who walks through that door." The room fell silent. Peterson glanced at the customers watching him, their expressions a mix of judgment and expectation. Finally, he sighed heavily, his shoulders sagging. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll make the changes." Maya nodded. "Good. This isn't just about fixing violations. It's about earning back the trust of your community. I hope you'll take this opportunity seriously." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked toward the door. As she left, Mrs. Jenkins smiled at her, offering a small nod of encouragement. Peterson watched her go, the weight of her words and the situation finally sinking in. For the first time, he began to question not just the state of his store, but the attitudes that had led him to this point. The days following the inspection were some of the most difficult Peterson had faced in his decades of running the store. The official notice from the Consumer Protection Agency arrived promptly, outlining the violations Maya had identified. Each line felt like a personal attack, even though Peterson knew deep down that the issues were of his own making. The financial penalties were steep, but they weren't the worst of it. The real blow came from the community. Word of Maya's inspection spread rapidly, and many loyal customers began to rethink their relationship with Peterson's store. Foot traffic dwindled as the weeks went on. Regulars stopped coming by, and new customers avoided the store altogether, wary of the stories circulating about Peterson's discriminatory practices. The once bustling shop now felt eerily quiet, the shelves as untouched as the cash register. Peterson's employees, too, began to lose patience with him. Kyle, who had worked there the longest, finally reached his breaking point. "Mr. Peterson," Kyle said one evening as they were closing up, "I can't keep doing this. I've tried to ignore the way you treat people, but it's wrong. It's always been wrong." Peterson frowned. "Kyle, I've been nothing but fair to you," he said defensively. "To me, maybe," Kyle replied, "but not to everyone else. You think people don't notice the way you act? They do. And now, they're done putting up with it." The next day, Kyle handed in his resignation, followed by 2 other employees. Peterson was left to run the store on his own, struggling to juggle inventory, customer service, and the mounting stress of his declining business. Meanwhile, the local media picked up on the story, amplifying the public's awareness of the situation. A reporter reached out to Maya for a comment, and while she declined to give an interview, she made a brief statement about the importance of accountability in businesses. "This isn't about one store," Maya said. "It's about creating a culture where every customer is treated with respect, regardless of their background. That's what we should all strive for." Her words resonated with the community, sparking conversations about fairness and inclusion in other local businesses. Several store owners began implementing changes, from introducing diversity training for employees to reviewing their customer service policies. Peterson, however, struggled to adjust. His attempts to make the required changes felt half-hearted, driven more by fear of further fines than by genuine understanding. He placed the mandatory consumer rights signage on the walls, cleared the clutter to improve accessibility, and set up a complaints register. But the damage to his reputation had already been done. One afternoon, Peterson sat alone behind the counter, staring at the empty store. The bell above the door hadn't chimed in hours, and the only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning. He thought about the confrontation with Maya, the customers who had called him out, and the employees who had walked away. For the first time, Peterson felt the full weight of his actions. His arrogance, his refusal to change, and his dismissive attitude toward people like Maya had cost him more than just money. It had cost him his community, his employees, and the trust of the people he had taken for granted. That evening, Peterson wrote a letter to the Consumer Protection Agency, outlining the changes he had made and requesting a follow-up inspection to demonstrate his compliance. But even as he wrote, he knew that legal compliance wasn't enough. He needed to make amends, not just to save his store, but to rebuild the relationships he had damaged. For Maya, the days following the inspection were a mix of reflection and gratitude. The community's response had been overwhelmingly positive, with many people reaching out to thank her for taking a stand. Each message reinforced her belief in the importance of accountability and fairness. One afternoon, Maya sat at a cafe, sipping tea as she scrolled through her emails. A message from Mrs. Jenkins caught her eye. "Dear Maya, thank you for everything you've done. People like me don't always have the courage to speak up, but seeing you take action has given me hope. Your bravery reminds us all that change is possible." Maya smiled, her resolve strengthened by the words of support. She hadn't embarked on this journey seeking recognition, but knowing that her actions had inspired others made it all worthwhile. The impact of her efforts extended far beyond Peterson's store. Other businesses in the area began implementing changes to ensure their practices were inclusive and customer-friendly. Workshops on diversity and consumer rights became a common sight in the community, sparking conversations about the importance of respect in all aspects of life. Even the Consumer Protection Agency took notice. Maya's comprehensive report on Peterson's store set a new standard for how similar cases would be handled in the future. Her attention to detail and professionalism were praised by her colleagues, and she was asked to lead a team focused on addressing systemic issues in small businesses. For Maya, the true victory wasn't in the penalties imposed on Peterson. It was in the ripple effect her actions had created. She had turned a moment of humiliation into an opportunity for growth and change, not just for herself, but for an entire community. Meanwhile, Peterson began to feel the consequences of his actions in a way that extended beyond fines and a tarnished reputation. Customers who had once been loyal to his store now favored businesses that prioritized fairness and respect. Former employees shared stories about the toxic environment under his leadership, further eroding his credibility. But even in the face of these challenges, there were glimmers of hope. One evening, Peterson wrote a letter to Maya. In it, he expressed regret for his behavior and acknowledged the harm he had caused. "I've spent a lot of time reflecting on what happened," he wrote. "I realize now that my actions weren't just unprofessional. They were wrong. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm committed to doing better." When Maya received the letter, she read it carefully, her emotions a mix of surprise and cautious optimism. While she didn't respond immediately, she hoped that Peterson's words were genuine and that he would follow through on his promise to change. For Maya, the experience had been a reminder of the power of resilience and the importance of standing up for what's right. It wasn't just about holding one person accountable. It was about inspiring others to challenge injustice whenever and wherever they saw it. Maya's journey proved that standing up to injustice, even in the smallest ways, can lead to meaningful change. Her actions not only held Peterson accountable, but also sparked a broader conversation about respect, inclusivity, and fairness. The community learned that silence enables discrimination, while courage and accountability can dismantle it. For Peterson, the experience was a harsh but necessary wake-up call, reminding him that growth begins with owning one's mistakes. Maya's story serves as a powerful reminder that when we confront prejudice with dignity and determination, we create ripples that inspire change far beyond the moment.